I'm Norma Levy, New Plaza's president. New Plaza is a nonprofit organization showing independent and foreign films to Manhattan's Upper West Side for the past 2 years. Today, Gary Palmucci, our curator, has selected a 1953 Academy Award nominated film directed by Federico Fellini himself. It's called Evitaloni. The film tells the story of 5 young men at crucial turning points in their small town lives. It's a fabulous film. I hope you had a chance to see it. Max Alvarez is off on a well-deserved vacation. So today, Gary will be joined by Kathleen Blanchard, one of our many accomplished patrons and a great film aficionado and enthusiast. So sit back, enjoy the talk back, and I'll turn it over to Gary. Gary?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us once again on this sultry Sunday. I'm told that we have a record number of people watching and listening in today, so we're thrilled and maybe a tad nervous. We'll see. Many of you may remember that in our first planned program back in March at the Museum of Art and Design, we had scheduled Federico Fellini's early film, The White Sheik, in honor of his centenary, his 100th birthday, which was going to be observed all over the city this year. We all know what happened to that and the subsequent events. But we felt we'd be remiss in not doing a Fellini film on this program sometime this year. And his best work still seems as vivid and influential as ever. And one of his pole star films to me is still his 1953 Evitaloni. With Max on vacation, we invited Kathleen Blanchard, an Upper West Sider. She actually lives, ironically, in the building that housed the former Lincoln Plaza, and a film lover, as you'll soon hear, to come on today as kind of a guest commentator. She's been on a number of our podcasts and has asked a few questions on The Last Picture Show and other films. So, Kathleen, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much to Norma, Gary, and the board of the New Plaza Cinema for the honor and privilege of joining today, co-hosting with Gary. I very much appreciate the Cinemmersion that Gary curated for me in preparations for today, all the support and kindness that he has shown. Really appreciate that. And as you might have seen from my short bio, that I'm a lawyer, and so what's a lawyer without disclaimers? And so let me confess that before now, the only Fellini film that I had actually watched was Satyricon for a college English class. And I found it so bizarre that it actually left me a little bit scarred and leery of Fellini. And perhaps that was a gross misperception. So thankfully, I found, to my delight, that not all Fellini films are such a hot mess. Happy today.
Well, before we get into Fellini, and yes, some of you may remember Satyricon, which Martin Scorsese once called Fellini doing science fiction in reverse to portray ancient Rome. But we really have to commend Kathleen for really doing some homework and watching several late 40s Italian neo-realist classics and subsequent Fellini pictures to get some before and after context. So, Catherine, tell us a little bit about your this is the second time I've done this today. Kathleen, your reaction to, first of all, Rome Open City, kind of the granddaddy of the Italian neo-realist movement from which Fellini and many other great directors' careers then sprang.
Yeah, I watched Rome Open City, and it is actually a favorite film of a good friend of mine as well. And it was very powerful. I was surprised at how devastated it actually left me. And the neo-realism films to me are like being dropped into the lives of real people. It's not really a drama so much as it is dramatic, and it's not a documentary, but it is actually the feeling of being amongst people as they go about a difficult period in their lives. And certainly Rome Open City, with the occupation of Rome and the resilience of the people of Rome, was really, really touching to me. And I found it a very unflinching depiction of the hardship of life at that time. I was really quite touched by it.
There's that amazing ability to make it look like a newsreel or a documentary film, and even when Anna Magnani is dramatically shot down on the street, midway through Open City, you feel like you're seeing, this is a real person, not a movie star who's having a tragic death. You also saw Bicycle Thief, which is maybe a slightly more optimistic take by Vittorio De Sica, although still very tough and very gritty.
Yeah, I also saw Bicycle Thief. I remember you asked me, Gary, whether or not I was devastated by Rome Open City, and you asked me whether I thought Bicycle Thief was a little more hopeful, and actually I wouldn't call it that. It was definitely another great film that showed the struggles of a family and a father trying to make a living for his children, and it was just kind of hard to see all the difficulty that they went through, but it felt very real. And actually, it's sort of funny because I moved to New York from California, and back home in my hometown, people are getting their bicycles stolen. And so it seems somewhat reminiscent in terms of today, people are still struggling to get along. And one of the things that they might try to help themselves to are bicycles. It was difficult. The other thing that struck me about these two movies is the children in the movie are so natural in the way that they act. It lent itself to the realism that touched me from these movies.
Well, so moving along to Evitaloni, Fellini by this time had made his first couple of films. He'd been a screenwriter on probably 24 Italian films by other directors at this point, and he based the story of Evitaloni on his hometown on the Adriatic Sea, a town called Rimini, and a couple of the characters have some autobiographical resonances as well. So, and Kathleen also looked at some later Fellini pictures. We may talk about that a little bit later on, but for now, we dug up the original Italian trailer of Evitaloni, which again is revelatory to see how these films were sold in their home country in their day. So let's roll that trailer, and then we'll be back.
Signore e signori, abbiamo il piacere di annunciarvi che questo film, premiato alla 14ª Mostra d'Arte Cinematografica a Venezia con il Leone d'Argento, sta per arrivare nella nostra città. Chi sono i Vitelloni? Perché si chiamano così? Dove vivono? Cosa fanno? Chi sono i Vitelloni?
Ma chi sei?
Oraldo.
Chi sei?
Oraldo.
Non sei nessuno. Non siete nessuno.
Questo film ha riportato a Venezia il più grande successo di critica e di pubblico perché ogni spettatore ha riconosciuto nei personaggi del racconto un po' di se stesso. Ognuno si è sentito un po' Vitellone.
Ecco che andrei in Africa io, con Esther Willis.
Perché con Franca Marzi no?
Franca Marzi, Gigi Rogers.
Grazie.
No, no!
Basta!
Scanzonato, spregiudicato, coraggioso e soprattutto divertente, questo film vi riempirà di sensazioni nuove. Ritroverete voi stessi, i vostri amici, i vostri parenti, le vostre donne.
Giuro sulla tomba della tua povera mamma che questa è l'ultima mascalzonata che fai. Il padre di quella ragazza è un galantuomo come me.
È un film che non vi racconta bugie. Momenti di spensierata allegria si alternano con altri di desolato sconforto.
Papà! Dove vai? Parti?
Guido. Sì, parto.
E dove vai?
Non lo so, parto, non lo so.
In vettura! In vettura!
Sandra, ma che fai? Piangi?
No, no, no.
Ma sì, stai piangendo, che hai? Che t'ho fatto?
Ho paura.
Ma di che?
Le speranze più accese e le delusioni più feroci.
Tutto quello che mi ha detto, stavo per abbandonare tutto, i miei sogni di ragazzo, le mie speranze.
Tutta la vita di una cittadina di provincia in un film indimenticabile, ideato e diretto dal più originale regista italiano, Federico Fellini.
Se non torna m'ammazzo.
Tu non t'ammazzerai mai. Sei un vigliacco.
Franco Interlenghi, nel tormentato personaggio di Moraldo. Alberto Sordi, il più incosciente dei Vitelloni. Franco Fabrizi, cinico e puerile. Leopoldo Trieste, l'intellettuale della compagnia, l'artista ambizioso. Riccardo Fellini, ottimista e spensierato, hanno dato vita ai 5 Vitelloni, non li dimenticherete più. E insieme a loro, Leonora Ruffo nella dolce e patetica figura della sposina umiliata. E ancora un Jean Brochard, Claude Farel, Carlo Romano, Arlette Sauvage, Enrico Viarisio, Paola Borboni e Achille Maieroni.
Folks, it's a very interesting trailer. It's on YouTube, and it runs about 3.5 minutes, and it will have Italian identification on it. That's the way to pick it out among the many other Vitelloni clips that are on YouTube. But you know, Kathleen, as we were discussing this, you had a very interesting expression that I don't think I've ever heard before, describing the film. You want to tell us what that was?
I'll get to that in a second. I just want to interrupt this programming to recognize that we have so many new people who are joining us today, which is fabulous. And just as a reminder, the way the program flows is that Gary and I will chat. It's usually Max and Gary who chat, and then we'll open it up for questions and comments. And so at that point, the facilitator will call on people in turn to unmute themselves and reveal themselves and ask their question or make their comment. And so if everybody can mute and turn off your video up until that point before you're called on, that would be great. So back to our regular programming. Evitaloni, I found to be both a film with a critical eye and a loving feel to it. And the term that came to my mind as I watched it, as Fellini was showing these layabouts, was that it was like a dope slap by a loving mother. You know, it was a critical eye on the lives of these young gentlemen who either had dreams and ambitions and were not really acting on them, or didn't have any at all. And even though it was a bit of a critical eye, it was still a very loving eye. And so I took away from that quite a lot of affection. And so that's why I called it kind of a video dope slap.
Well, Vitelloni apparently in Italian is slang for literally the calves, I guess, the callow, irresponsible youth, which is what these 5 gentlemen are, I guess. And when the film was released in America several years after the Italian release, it was called The Young and the Passionate, which was a little more dimensionless, I guess, in my view, and then not unlike the way a number of foreign films were treated in America at that time. But so with these 5 young men, we have I guess you would call him the lead character, Moraldo, who is meant to be kind of a stand-in for Federico Fellini. He's the observer, the reflective one, the one who eventually has to leave town, as we saw very eloquently in that final scene. Alberto, played by Alberto Sordi, who later became a big Italian comic star, who's kind of half buffoonish and has a very interesting relationship, kind of hypocritical relationship with his sister, Kathleen. You were particularly focused on that in those 2 or 3 scenes with the sister who finally also had to leave town.
Yeah, it was very interesting. Alberto, you know, tries to be the big man about his family, and he's constantly judgmental about his sister and the affair that she's having with the married man. And he's telling her to be, you know, to change her ways because they certainly don't want to upset mama and make their mama cry. And yet at the same time, she's the one that's working so hard late at night, making a living for the whole family. And also it was interesting because she's the one who finally decides to make a break for it and leave with her married lover and start a new life. So I thought that was a very interesting contrast between her and her brother, who was the one who was trying to be so judgmental and the big man in the family. But I felt that maybe he was the laziest one of the bunch after all.
Well, and then we have Fausto, the character, I guess, who probably provokes the most extreme reactions of the 5. And one of the movies I suggested to Kathleen to watch was Martin Scorsese's 1973 classic Mean Streets, which to me is kind of a loose remake of Evitaloni. They're very influential, and will rattle off some other American movies I think that were very influenced by it. But I guess we could say Fausto is kind of the Johnny Boy of Evitaloni, constantly getting into trouble, usually by coming on to a whole variety of women that he meets over the course of the story, from the shopkeeper's wife, where he has a job, a woman sitting next to him and his wife in a cinema, some professional ladies who pass through town later in the story, constantly getting into trouble, yet seeming to have at least a redemptible side to him, although we never quite see how that turns out. Of course, the story, as the narrator says, this is the end of the story for now. We don't know what's going to happen to Fausto and his wife.
Yeah, Fausto was an interesting character. I mean, it's interesting. I watched Mean Streets, and I have to say that my first reaction to Mean Streets was that it was a little hard for me to watch. Unlike Evitaloni, which I thought was a critical reality picture, I did feel that it had a lot of heart in it. I found it hard to find an affection for any of the particular characters in Mean Streets, but it was definitely a very real picture, very gritty. I don't know that I actually would have equated Johnny Boy, who was played by Robert De Niro, and just a remarkable job by Robert De Niro.
Unrecognizable to you, right, at the time.
It took me a long time to finally realize that was Robert De Niro. But both of them had their faults for sure. The interesting thing I thought about Fausto was that even though he can't help but chase women, he actually seems to really care about Sandra, his new bride. Every time she cries, he seems to be deeply affected by that. And the other interesting thing about Fausto, or about the way he was depicted, as you mentioned, is that he was clearly attracted to the shopkeeper's wife, an older woman, and it just seemed very natural and not anything unusual about that. And I really appreciated that Fellini showed us that, which can be very affirming, which I found a little bit interesting, in contrast to a later film of his, 8 and a Half, where he depicted an older woman.
Right. I think that's the first time I've ever heard that description applied to any of Fausto's behavior in the film. But yeah, his attraction and the obviously the wife of the shopkeeper struggling with her own feelings and their interplay is that's a read on it that I think I've heard before. Then we have the other two lead characters, Leopoldo, the kind of boring, windy, aspiring playwright who has his tragicomic encounter with the thespian passing through town with his traveling troupe, and the thespian paying attention to him only apparently to lure him out to the waterfront for some tawdry business, which Leopoldo doesn't realize until it's almost too late. And then Federico Fellini's brother, playing sort of the fifth character, whom we don't see too much of in the film, really. His big scene seems to be at the very beginning, where he announces the winner of the town beauty contest as a downpour suddenly comes crashing down on the seaside town. You were also voting to include the station boy kind of as one of the important characters in the film, if not a major character, right? He seems to be he's kind of a messenger in some ways to the various emotional comings and goings of the other guys.
Yeah, the young boy. I was, when the young boy showed up, it was interesting because Moraldo, who seems to be the conscience of the bunch, is constantly observing and unable to sleep at night. He seemed a bit of an insomniac, and I wasn't sure what that was about. Maybe it was just Fellini has trouble sleeping, and if Moraldo represented Fellini, and he meets the boy, and I was actually reminded of our last talk back, where the babysitter showed up in the life of Betty, and it was a young person. And
Lancaster.
Yeah, and I was Burt Lancaster playing Betty. I was a little worried that there'd be something odd about the young boy and Moraldo, but I was pleased that there was not. And the funny thing is that the oddness showed up with Leopoldo and vaudeville actor. We can talk a little bit more about that vaudeville actor. But anyway, it turned out that they just struck up an innocent friendship, and I sort of took away that the boy represented boyhood, and at the end, you talk about the end, Gary, how touching
Yes.
the end of the story was.
Well, I'd like to kind of save that for a little bit later, because that's really an ending that's always stuck with me, and it's been beautifully described by various writers and film people over the years. But another interesting angle that you came up with, Kathleen, is the idea that there's almost kind of a quintet of mirror images among the women in the film, and you don't necessarily think of this Vitelloni as really much of a women's picture, but just to use a very simple term. But starting with Sandra, Valsto's wife.
Yeah, Sandra, very sweet, and at first it seems that she's rather demure and really just a victim of all his womanizing and
Clueless,
a bit clueless. Just and again, Valsto seems to care for her. I was struck by, to your point, the importance of the women in the lives, even though they seem to be in the background. They're a very important foundation, and I noticed that that mothers in particular wield great power in the family, and she, even though she is a mother technically because she's had the baby, it doesn't seem like she's wielding power until the time when she gets fed up and she leaves for the day and runs away, and it really shakes up Valsto a lot. And I wondered if that might be a bit of a turning point in the power relationship between the two. And
her mother, of course, who very curtly says to Valsto and his father that since Valsto has no means of support at this time, then of course he will live with Sandra and her mother. There's no discussion about that. It's just a fait accompli of the Italian equivalent.
Yeah, definitely. It seems like the mothers are very strong, and like Alberto's mother too, right? There's just something about the reverence and the power that Italian mothers have in their family. I'm actually quite envious about that.
So, well, you know, that final scene where we see Meraldo kind of becoming fed up with much of what he's seeing among his friends, or the general state of anime in the town, and he gets on an early morning train and rides off somewhere. He never quite says where he's going, but I guess if he's Fellini's stand-in, he's probably going to Rome to try to break in as a screenwriter or something. But yeah, there's something sort of consummately beautiful about that final sequence where we see Fellini intercut the shots of various people's bedrooms, all his friends and family that he knows who are still asleep, who have not woken up yet, and he's going out of town, and you know, it kind of sums up that moment that virtually all of us have at some point where we have to make a clean break from wherever we started or wherever we are, and it's very profound, very, very beautiful to me. And another thing, I think that this was the second film that was scored by Nino Rota, who became Fellini's longtime composer, scored every one of his pictures, including the others that you saw, up to the late 1970s. And that's just a beautiful theme that I won't try to whistle it or hum it at this point, but I think I bet a number of us can call it to mind right now because it dominates the film musically, and it's one of Nino Rota's many beautiful themes. Now you went on and saw a couple of other Fellini pictures that sort of shed a little more light on this also in his later development.
Yes, I saw Nights of Cabiria. Nights of Cabiria. And I really, oh my gosh, I loved Giulietta Messina.
Mrs. Fellini.
This is a Fellini film, right?
I said Mrs. Fellini.
Mrs. Fellini, that's right. Yep, Mrs. Fellini, and she was a delight. I loved her. I am a huge fan. I highly recommend that movie or any movie that she's in. I think she's in La Strada and some others as well that I have yet to see. You know, she's so expressive and so full of life. I had this thought that if Charlie Chaplin and Lucille Ball had a love child, it would be Giulietta Messina. She was just amazing. I loved that movie.
Well, I think they both influenced her performances in Fellini's films.
Yes, definitely. You know, in the beginning of that film, when she was almost drowned and she got saved and she was referred to as a cat, you know, because she seemed like come back to life and maybe she had multiple lives. And I think that was sort of a theme that showed up at the end of the movie as well, where she'd gone through another bad experience, but seemed like she was going to come back again and into a new life. So I love that movie. I really highly recommend it as well. And
the other one you looked at is the film which I think to me is still his masterwork, and we talked about once we got talking about it, we said we've got to do this on the program at some point later in the year. Eight and a half.
8.5. Oh my gosh. So I only watched that last night, and that is definitely a movie I'm going to have to come back to and deconstruct. And I know on the one hand, it wasn't as difficult to follow as Satyricon, which, as we talked about, was a bit
or as I had warned you about.
Yeah, that's right. But it was fascinating, and it seemed to be about the filmmaking process itself, which I appreciated on the one level, and how much a director is put upon by others who are seeking some piece of the action, and then at the same time he is reminiscing about all the things in his life, and he's trying to tell a story and struggling to put that vision and that dream into something solid that people could receive. And it really made me appreciate the challenge of filmmaking and storytelling, trying to get the emotion and the feeling and the images that you have in your mind and the feelings that you have in your hearts, and do it in a way that other people could sort of understand and appreciate.
You really see how he matured as an artist in this decade from 1953 to 63. And well, there's a lot more to say about Evitaloni, and in a few minutes, we're going to invite some of our viewers in to ask some questions. Just remind you, as Kathleen did earlier, hit the participant button, and then also your check the box next to your name over on the far right. But before we get to that, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of American films which were influenced by Evitaloni, I think, very clearly, which you and I also talked about. Mean Streets, of course, The Last Picture Show, which we had on a few weeks ago. George Lucas's American Graffiti, about a small town. Modesto, I guess that's a bit of a drive from Palo Alto, not that close to you, right? But I bet you're familiar with it.
Yeah.
And the other one I was thinking of, we talked about, was Diner, Barry Levinson's film, set in Baltimore in the late 1950s. That's a favorite of yours, right?
Oh, Diner, I watched Diner. When I watched Diner, it really touched me, and it's really stuck with me. And it's a movie that it's always in me. And it was interesting when I watched Evitaloni, it reminded me of Diner. And of course, it should be the other way around, right? Evitaloni, yes, one that influenced Diner, but both
okay.
Me, right?
Yep. Okay, I think we're ready for some questions, and I saw a few of them coming in by text, and hopefully some of these folks will be on with us now. So let's fire away.
Yeah, so let's ask Marjorie if you can turn on your camera and unmute yourself. Marjorie?
Yeah, I'm trying. Okay. Here. Wait. Where's my camera?
There you are.
Okay. Oh, thank you. Yes, I read long time ago that Federico Fellini himself was the narrator in this film, and I was wondering if that was if you've heard anything about that.
Wow, that's a great question. I have to do some research on that. I have to believe that's not Fellini's voice as I have heard it. I think Fellini has more like of a high-pitched voice, and this guy sounds more like a professional narrator to me. That's my guess. But yeah. I think that's a subject for further research.
Yeah. Also, you mentioned these other films, which definitely does have a bearing with Evitaloni. But watching Evitaloni, I really couldn't help but thinking of La Dolce Vita, where instead of a small town middle class, these were some opulent people in the big city, but their lives were kind of parallel. They just went from like one event to another event without having any meaning. So La Dolce Vita is the one that really came to my mind. I was wondering if anybody else had that opinion.
Well, I think you're right in the sense that that's what the characters are doing in La Dolce Vita on a completely different milieu than what we see in the small town in Evitaloni. But I think that's certainly that sense of aimlessness, and Marcello, like the characters in Evitaloni, he winds up at the ocean at the end, right? Kind of aimless and uncertain about his life, like the guys looking out to sea in that beautiful moment in Evitaloni.
Yeah, that's exactly what I thought, that it's really like a small town or a big city, but it's really what's in you that's going to count.
I agree.
Okay. Let's ask Eleanor. Can you unmute yourself and turn on your camera, please?
Sure.
You're on. Eleanor?
Eleanor has to unmute.
Yes, can you hear me now? You mentioned how touching that last scene was, and the young boy who works at the station house, and at the station.
Eleanor, you have remuted yourself. If you could unmute, there you go.
I didn't touch anything.
Oh.
It just happened. The way it struck me was that the boy was totally content with his life, that he came from the opposite dynamic that Valsto and his friends did. He was eager to get this job. He was happy to have this job. Probably would be content for the rest of his life to be working at the station. And it didn't occur to him. I think Valsto or what's his name asked him about leaving town. He would never leave. The life there is full and complete for him. So it's very opposite of the restless spirit.
Right. He was happy to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning, right, to go to the station. I can't imagine any of us would also be.
Yeah, but he wasn't complaining.
No, I think you're absolutely right. That's another side of life in that town, in contrast to most of the others.
Okay, Claudine, if you can start or unmute yourself, Claudine. Yeah.
Okay, so I've been blown away by Fellini forever. I think La Dolce Vita really encapsulated something for me. But you mentioned, Gary, music, Anita Roti, as one of the characteristics. A Fellini movie, to me, has a definite patina. What are some of the other details that make a Fellini movie? I'm asking you the question, but I'm thinking like the wind. That seems to be a theme. Are there other themes that you might cite that make a Fellini movie what it is?
Well, I could think of 3 or 4, and I bet Kathleen can add a couple as well. I think some kind of a constant parties of one sort or another, like we see at the beginning of Evitaloni, and the Carnival scene, that kind of tumultuous life. I thought for a moment it was New Year's Eve, but it's not really spelled out specifically. Hanging out like we see in the pool halls and so forth. A fascination with the ocean, with water. It seems like in almost every Fellini picture there's a scene by the sea, including the ones we mentioned. And the other thing that I was just thinking, and I think it just went in and out of my head. Well, I'm going to let Kathleen chime in. I'll see if I can.
Back to you, Gary. I'm sure it will come back. But you had mentioned before the vaudeville,
yes, the third and fourth rate performers that we see either in the circus players or that whatever that was stage show that was going on there with Leopoldo trying to impress the leading man, who was a famous Italian actor named Achille Maggioroni, a great name. He plays that decrepit sort of perverse character.
Yeah, and it's interesting because he's taking off his stage makeup, and yet afterwards he still looks like he's got a lot of stage makeup on. He looks like a very bizarre character, and then the other films I was watching by Fellini, The Nights of Cabiria, there was a magician, and he's also made up like that. And then also in 8½, there's another person there who's also made up with that very white face and dark features, kind of clownish. And I remember a viewer at one of our prior talkbacks, I don't remember what it was that we were talking about, but he was asking about whether or not what was the meaning of all the clowns and circus sort of characters that show up in Fellini films, right? And that seems to be a constant thing. And Gary, I think you might have mentioned that that was something that was an influence in his life from early on. Maybe
Well, very, very, very much so. And just, I think also Fellini has this talent for unforgettable images that once we see them, we can't forget, of all different kinds. The opening shot of La Dolce Vita, of that helicopter carrying a giant religious statue across Rome, the fake Miracle in the Rain in La Dolce Vita, the wonderful, amazing shot of Marcello Mastroianni at the beginning of 8½, having a dream where he's on a rope high above a beach, and then suddenly the rope gives out and he plummets to earth. And then, of course, we cut away to him, waking up in some kind of...
One other, do you think some of the I've noticed grotesqueries, where crowds, the faces, he seems to pick out extras that have a certain, I wonder what's the meaning, or do you think of him as a pessimist, or maybe I'm just getting too carried away with all these themes, but I'm just wondering about whether you consider him a pessimist basically, or such a realist that it sometimes becomes painful to watch. I just would like.
I guess I would think of him maybe as an optimistic pessimist or something. There's something about the endings to virtually all his films, like Kathleen, when Giulietta Mazzina is kind of walking away in Nights of Cabiria, and she's been devastated, and yet she has some kind of epiphany there where you say, well, maybe she's really going to turn her life around in some way. Or when Marcello is making that famous hand gesture on the beach at the end of La Dolce Vita, he may find some kind of new realization. Or when all those people join him marching around the circus stage at the end of 8½, there's something beautifully lilting about that too.
Thank you.
What about music? Music is a big thing.
We talked about Nino Rota.
Yeah, like 8½, and all the exits and entrances, but music throughout Fellini films are big themes.
Thank you, Jane. I was just going to say, Claudine, that when you speak of the grotesquerie that shows up, I think this is what I've come away from the Fellini films that I've watched, which was he can find something loving in so many things, right? We might find those grotesque, we might find those unusual, and yet there's a feeling of affection for that even still. So there's like this human element that he's able to find so many different ways, no matter where he looks.
From what I understand, casting those extras was one of the things he took the most delight in and took the most time in. And Kathleen, you can imagine that casting Satyricon with all those, grotesque characters in there must have been probably as much fun as he ever had making a film.
Definitely, yeah.
Even if you might not have had that reaction.
Okay, we have Pat next, but we just have a couple of questions. So if you want to ask a question, reminder, hit participant and raise your hand. And then we'll wait for Pat to turn on her video.
Gary, do you know if Fellini shot on location? It's clear the exteriors are on location, but were interiors too, which is a hallmark of neorealism.
Well, we were talking about that with this film, and I think more definitive research perhaps would have to be done. My feeling was clearly we had all those beautiful exteriors in the town, the beauty pageant at the beginning, the scenes at the beach, the railroad station, etc. But I think some of the other stuff struck me as like probably studio interiors of some kind, either in Rome or elsewhere, like the Carnival scene.
Yes,
and
I was thinking that.
Some of the bedrooms and interior scenes. It has a little bit of a studio feel to it, a mix, I would say.
Yeah. So I had a second question, and that is, can you say anything more about the autobiographical elements in this film?
Well, I saw in one of the comments we had, and it'd be nice if this person came on and joined us, somebody who had actually been to the town of Rimini and was making some comments about it. And I understand it's still a popular tourist attraction to go to. I had some friends who visited it maybe 15 years ago. It's not a hugely popular tourist attraction, but there is the Fellini connection. And I think my sense is, from what I have read, is that, Fellini grew up in this town, and he, perhaps not unlike Moraldo, he had to get out of there at a certain point. It was that kind of a place where, and I think also the whole business of Mussolini coming to power in the 20s and 30s in Italy and coming to these towns and, you know, giving the speeches. And you see that in Amarcord, of course. You see Mussolini's appearance in a town not unlike the one we saw in Evitaloni. I think that was the effect that had on the population was another thing that I think that prompted Fellini to say, you know, this is not for me. I've got to move on in life.
And what is your thought about the actors or the characters having mostly the same names as their actors? Alberto, and so on.
Well, I guess there's probably some kind of a hint at autobiography in some of those characters. I think you find this in a number of European films where sometimes the characters just simply are named after whatever the actor's name is. It doesn't strike me as unusual. I wouldn't want to get too specific about it. What do you think, Kathleen?
Well, Gary, I was wondering about that too. So it was a great question. I wondered if it was the thing that reflected the realism of it. Like you are not playing a character, Alberto is playing Alberto, right? He is playing a character, yes, for sure. But at the same time, I didn't know whether or not there was some way of making us feel as though, or making the actor feel as though he or she were more depicting a real person as opposed to a character. I mean, this is the thing that I took away from the realism films, which is that it didn't feel like people were playing characters so much as they were playing themselves.
Well, I would certainly agree with that. I'm not sure if all 5 of the characters use their own names or not. It's a little inconsistent, but it may well be that those guys had that background, all of them.
They could be nicknames.
That's also not uncommon in Italian. And I think, Pat, you've traveled in Italy extensively. I think you and I have talked about this, right? Yes. Are you still doing those vineyard trips to Italy?
Yes, until this year.
All right. Wow.
So,
next we have Sonia. And Sonia, I'm not sure. I don't see. You might not have sound. So let's see. Can we see Sonia?
Sonia, can you start speaking? Maybe we can hear you.
You know what? It looks like there might be a technical difficulty with Sonia. Let's go to Andy. Andy, if you can unmute yourself and turn on your camera, I'd appreciate it.
We have another person commenting about Rimini here. That would be nice to hear from Anita.
Yeah. So hi, this is Andy, and I have a comment, first of all, that I think Bob Fosse is our current day Fellini because of the theatricality of Bob Fosse and his fascination with the grotesque.
What is all that jazz if not a remake of 8½?
Right, and also Pippin.
And Woody Allen's Stardust Memory, also a Memory, is also a remake of 8½, right?
Right. So, but my real question is, what has happened to the legacy of Italian filmmaking? It was so strong back in the 50s and the 60s with De Sica and Rossellini and Fellini, etc. And today it seems to have dried up. What happened?
Well, I don't think. I think I would agree with that up to a point, in that the 40s, 50s, and 60s were an extraordinary period in international cinema as a whole. I think a moment in time that I don't know if that is going to be duplicated again in our lifetime. On the other hand, I think you will find, although they don't often last long in New York or American cinemas in general, there is a young, very talented wave of Italian directors out there doing good work. Directors like Matteo Garrone, Luca Guadagnino, who made Call Me By Your Name, the gentleman who made the film La Gran Bellezza, which won the Oscar in 2013 for Best Foreign Film. A very good young director who did took on for me, very uncharacteristic subject matter, a remake of Jack London's novel Martin Eden. And this film is going to be commercially released in New York sometime in 2020, and I would recommend it. So I think there is talent there. They're not finding the commercial success that maybe the Pedro Almodovars and some other French directors and maybe a few others are finding. or some Asian directors now. We've seen that happen amazingly enough. But there is talent working in Italy, but you have to look harder for it than you did back in that amazing heyday.
Okay, let's see. Christy, if you could start your video. Christy.
Hi, how are you? Thank you so much. This has really been fun. I did have a comment, but then I just wanted to also say a couple of things before my comment. I watched the documentary on the making of this film by Criterion, and in reference to, it was either Marjorie or Eleanor asking if Fellini did the voiceover. He didn't, but he did do one thing. When Moraldo is leaving on the train and says, ciao, ciao, addio, addio, Fellini, he did the voiceover for that with his own voice, which I thought was really a beautiful touch because it just made you understand how profoundly he was attached to this film.
Well, that's
the other little thing is that the name of the character Moraldo is actually from the assistant director. Fellini had asked him to play that character or to be the assistant director, and he decided that he was going to be the assistant director, and so they used his name for the main character. I just wanted to say two little tiny scenes really showed a lot of spark and meaning, which was the scene where the really poor man on the beach who lives in a hovel was given the Madonna, who was the golden Madonna, and it was like it dropped out of the sky. And the scene of him, you know, touching it and just bewilderment of this gift was just really very, very poetic and touching to me. And the other thing is going back to the little station boy, you know, I really felt that scene was great because he knew who he was. He understood that he loved to work and he felt comfortable with himself. And I also thought that I didn't feel like he was really, he might stay and he might go. He might just be another Moraldo. It could be that it was the younger and the older version of the same character having this really, really moving moment together. So anyway, that's my comment.
Well, thank you very much for that. You know, sometimes Max and I try to watch the Criterion extras when there's a Criterion disc of the film, because you get great stuff from those all the time. The one on the 400 blows, we cribbed heavily on that when we did the 400 blows.
I'll have to watch that. Thank you.
Didn't get to this one in Evitaloni, but thank you.
It's very good. It's
one of your
wonderful.
colleagues.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, Natalie. Natalie, you are up for your question. If you could unmute yourself and turn on your camera. Natalie?
I'm unmuting myself and I'm starting my video. Okay.
Great. Perfect.
Yes?
We can hear you. We can see you, Natalie.
Great. Okay. Well, I was in Rimini many years ago, but there was a fantastic sensation that I've never forgotten. On the beach, there were these swings, you know, very tall, long, adult kind of swings, and you could just sit on them. They were and face the sea and swing back and forth and watch the sea. And that's something I haven't seen anyplace else. I was told that they're still there. Yes, the beach is a huge theme for Fellini. There are things on the beach in Amarcord that are really beautiful images. And so yeah, the beach plays a big role. I wanted to say about clowns, which are another theme. In the beginning, when Alberto is at the carnival, when he's dancing with, well, not, toward the end of the carnival, he's dancing with the head and he's cradling it. And he cradles it with such love, even though it's this huge, grotesque head. And then at the end, when he wanders out of the party scene down the steps, he's dragging it on a string. And he says with great affection, come on, come along, testone, which is like saying big head. So that seems to be his feeling toward clowns and the grotesque, that he's very attracted and loves them, even though they're grotesque. And he made a film called The Clowns, and I believe that Charlie Chaplin's daughter, Geraldine Chaplin, was in it. So there were some things I wanted to share.
One of his hardest to see films now, but I think it had a DVD release in the last year or so we can all revisit or catch up.
It's kind of a documentary, and it's not full length. I'm not sure it's his best film, but Fellini's least best film is better than somebody else's best film. So
I would
they're
agree.
all wonderful.
And it was great to get your firsthand account of Rimini. It sounds like it's almost like a Fellini set in some ways that's been preserved.
Yeah. Chloe, if you want to unmute yourself and start your video, that would be great. Chloe, did you have a question?
Looks like she's texting that she does not have a question.
Oh, okay. Thanks. Thanks for catching that, Gary. Okay. And Sonia, I'm going to try Sonia one more time and we'll just see. Sonia, if you can start your video. Okay. Okay, looks like that's not going to happen because the audio is disabled. So sorry about that. Okay, we don't have any other questions. And I'm not sure if there was anything in the chat that we should be discussing.
Have a look.
Certainly. Go ahead, Kathleen.
I was going to say there was a comment about there are many comments about the boy at the ending scene, and I think you mentioned, Gary, that in addition to seeing the boy walking back towards the town, balancing on the rails, and then the scenes of his friends in their bedrooms, to me it represented him leaving his friends behind, the sleepy town behind, his boyhood behind, and it was an interesting comment too about that the boy seemed very content to have a job and to be just working and living in the town. And it made me wonder because there are obviously people that work in the town, including Fausto's father, and yet it seems that the boys themselves are having a little bit of a struggle growing up and getting their own jobs and maturing. And I made me sort of wonder about the power of the Italian family and how the children live at home for a long time. And I wonder if it sort of delays their launch into maturity, at least as depicted in these films.
Well, you know, in that indelible final scene, there's another documentary which was done by Martin Scorsese about 20 years ago called My Voyage to Italy, and it covers Italian cinema from about 1945 to about 1960, and it's 4 hours long. They only got as far as 1960. But the part about Evitaloni is one of the highlights of the doc. I would recommend it to anybody who loves this film and all these others, many of which the ones Kathleen saw and talked about are in this film. And there's a very eloquent description of that last scene of him getting on the train and riding out of town. The narration written by either Marty Scorsese or his frequent collaborator, Kent Jones, about, you know, that moment when we all have to make a break of some kind in life. It's probably the best description of its kind that I've ever come across. I don't remember it verbatim, but I highly recommend it.
And I think,
Sean, I'm sorry, we do actually have a number of questions in the chat. I just wanted to point that out.
yeah, Marianne, are you going to?
Just wanted to, yes, hi. A comment, Gary, about the Italian movies and cinema. Is it not, you remember Cinecittà was such a big element of the Italian cinema? And isn't it because there is no more the Cinecittà that it has fallen out?
Well, I think Cinecittà still exists. I know a couple times when I visited Rome, you can get a tour of Cinecittà, and I think there's some production going on there. But there's just something about that time in movie history where all those productions that were being made in Rome, I think it was maybe cheaper to film over there, and these giant, ambitious films like the American Cleopatra and Visconti's The Leopard, and a lot of American stars who migrated over there because they still had some kind of popularity that they didn't have in America. I think it was this configuration of circumstances that made kind of, Hollywood on the Tiber, as somebody called it, I think, at the time.
Then there is a question about, is there any significance to women having most of the time non-Italian name?
You mean in this film?
Yeah. You
Well,
have an Olga, Sandra, etc.
Sandra to me is an Italian name, but I guess that's a point of discussion. Kathleen, can you remember some of the other names and their?
One is Olga.
Olga.
Alberta's sister is Olga, I think.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So no, so there is nothing. And then there was someone pointing to the fact that in Fausto, a connection with, the devil and people.
Well, I think that would not be unreasonable to think he's constantly, if he's not making a deal with the devil, he's certainly tempting him in some way, or being tempted.
Yeah.
At the same time, he works in the religious, the shop where there's all these religious items being sold, which is sort of odd too.
That's right.
Yeah. So I think that's all for the comments.
Okay, and no more questions.
Well, Sean, I guess we can say that if we can't have real political conventions this month, our next movie is going to try to fill in some of the gaps there, right?
That's right. So couple of things. First of all, thank you for your patience today without Saul here. But two things. On August 23rd, in 2 weeks, our next film, as Gary just mentioned, is Manchurian Candidate. And we have, we're in between the two conventions, and it's going to be very timely to do that. That's the 1962 version. I want to make sure we're clear on that. And then the other thing is, on August 19th, Max is doing a lecture again, and that's Wednesday, a week from Wednesday. And the lectures on Hitchcock films, and I think people will really enjoy that. So we hope that you will be able to join that as well.